Hello, everyone. This is Rick Kelly over at Fuel Cycle, and I'm excited to kick off today's webinar on building brand trust, how brands like Nike can uncover consumer motivations of the unconscious mind. Before we get started real quick, a couple logistical things. So we expect the webinar today to last around 20-25 minutes with about a 5-minute Q&A period afterwards. So feel free to type in your questions and ask, I'm sure, all the questions you have of Anders and myself, and we'll be happy to answer them for you at the end. And this webinar is going to be recorded. It will be available, so you can share it freely with your friends and family after we're done. And we'll go ahead and get started. So just to quickly introduce myself and Anders as well. So my name is Rick Kelly. I'm the SVP of Products and Research over here at Fuel Cycle. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend Anders Benson today. So Anders is a very smart man, and he's also the CEO of Protobrand and holds a PhD in consumer culture theory. He's spearheading the development of Metaphor Insight, a System 1 research software platform designed to reinvent quantitative research applications, including positioning development, concept testing, segmentation, and brand tracking. Prior to joining Protobrand, Anders is a marketing professor, and he has written extensively on consumers' symbolic and emotional relationships with brands and how brands become agents of consumer culture. Anders received his PhD in marketing from Lund University in Sweden. And so very excited to listen to Anders. He's one of my favorite people to learn from in the industry. And just to kind of set context here, so Anders is CEO of Protobrand, and we are obviously, or I'm at Fuel Cycle. And the quick context, and as you think about this, the reason we're doing this together is, over at Fuel Cycle, we're big believers in non-conscious measurement of attitudes and opinions of consumers. And also, Metaphor Insight is integrated with the Fuel Cycle Market Research Cloud at a kind of deep technology level. And so you can actually use Metaphor Insight through Fuel Cycle. And that's the context for why we're here together on this call. And I'm going to take a moment to breathe and turn this over to Anders at this point. Anders, are you there?
I am. Thank you so much, Rick. Well, pleasure meeting you all, and I can see all heads are nodding when I'm speaking, so that's great. So we're going to get started here in talking about how we can look at trust and from a more non-conscious perspective. And so just to set that into context a little bit, what you are looking at now is probably something that everyone is very familiar with. Like we measure in the old-fashioned way in terms of how we measure attributes and how people beliefs about brands. We do that in traditionally with cognitive questions, whether they are measured on a 5 or 7-point scale. And then you can look at percentages of top 2 box or bottom 2 box and try to understand differences between brands. Now, the problem is that the Likert scale is not particularly great at understanding these differences and what they really mean. And as you can see, the distribution here is the example we have on this page here. We have an average endorsement here of around 26% for these attributes here, and a distribution of 15%. So what can we learn from that, and what can we really make actionable for the brand? And these are some of the limitations that we see with traditional measurements. And so that leads us into looking at understanding brands from a different perspective. On the next slide, we're going to look at how we do that from a System 1 perspective. And what do we mean by System 1? Well, if you've read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, you may have come across the term referring to the non-conscious part, the automatic brain that operates below our consciousness. So in the fields of psychology and economics, this is where we get to behavioral science or behavioral economics to understand and get a different perspective or a different framework for how people make decisions about their consumption. Because at the end of the day, all kind of research studies that we do, we want to kind of predict and understand what is expected to be, what's going to happen in the marketplace. And that's where behavioral economics is just giving us both a lens for how we can do that in terms of what are the questions that we should be asking, how should we be framing questions, and also how should we think about how people make decisions. And for the longest time, the theory of the economic man, the Homo economicus, was a perspective that gave us that in a way that I think for a long time made us go wrong for a lot of market research. So this is where the System 1 approach is truly exciting because it recognizes the non-conscious dimensions of how people, that influences people's decision makings and the emotional connections that people make that we need to understand at much greater length. So that leads us to the next slide that introduces our technology here. And as Rick mentioned, this is fully integrated with the Fuel Cycle Cloud, the Research Cloud, the Meta for Insight technology. And so, just to clarify here, so I'm a CEO for Protobrand. Protobrand is the company behind this platform. If there's any confusion between the two, Meta for Insight is the specific application. So it's a piece of technology that works seamlessly in the cloud here with Fuel Cycle, and it enables you to run these studies in a very integrated way with other applications that are available in the cloud. So on this slide here, you see the particular technique of visual metaphor elicitation, which is one of the key applications for our technology here. It uses visual metaphors as a way to get people to express their deeper thoughts and feelings. And that can be in relation to a brand. It can be in relation to a new concept idea, a new product innovation idea. We use this in the context of advertising, testing, and so forth. So this is basically turning a question type, an open-ended question type, by using visual metaphors to enable people to articulate this in a more meaningful way. What's great about this, if you do any global applications, this is scalable to 47 languages. We use AI-powered text analytics to quantify the qualitative text data here, so really get the best of both worlds. On the next slide, you're going to see how this application is done in particular. So visual metaphor elicitation, this is the technique here. That was originally actually developed for face-to-face in-depth interviews. And that's like 20, 30 years ago that started to become, to be used. What we did with Meta for Insight was to develop a scalable platform to do this online in a way that takes the labor out of the data collection. Because I think all researchers love qualitative data. What no one likes is the fact that it's at least traditionally, was very slow to be collected and with small sample sizes. With Meta for Insight, you overcome both. You take the labor out of the interviewing process, and you can scale this with large number of respondents. So at the backbone of Meta for Insight, there is a image library of over 600 images that are validated to metaphor theory and emotion theory. So what respondent is experiencing here, as you see in step 1, that they get a question, and then they see images, and all the images are randomized for the respondent here, and they scroll into the library as far into the library as they want to. It's entirely their choice how far they want to go into the library before they make a selection. And you see here the question that we asked in step 1 for this particular study. We asked them to scroll down for more images before selecting one image that best captures what trust for Nike is built upon. That was the specific framing for this question here. One thing to note here with the images is that we are removing images that are directly literal to the brand. So you can imagine for Nike, images of running or sport activities are removed from the library because they're not metaphorical representations of the brand. And one note about that with metaphors, like why do we care about that? Well, humans naturally use metaphors to understand the world. That's not something that we learn. It's something that all humans do basically as we are born, as babies start to use metaphors to understand what's good in life. And initially everything that is basically related to mommy, and that's good in life. So metaphors are understood in that way, that you relate one thing to another. That's basically the use of a metaphor. In step 2 here, in this process, as the respondent goes through, once they have selected an image, they're asked to describe it. And that's just a step to enable the respondent to eventually make a more intelligent interpretation of how that image captured their thoughts about what trust is built upon for Nike. So at that stage, we asked them to write about 10 words or so, and just to identify what they see in the image, as if they describe the image to someone who can't see it. And then in step 3, that's where we ask them how this image captures what trust for Nike is built upon. And they answer with 20 to 25 words or so. And that's the text data that we then capture and then we process with text analytics. So imagine now that you have hundreds of respondents here. Traditionally, before the availability of text analytics, we would go through and manually code all of that data. And that's, of course, a tedious process. Now, text analytics is so powerful, and of course, machine learning, AI is key to that. That is getting better by the day. And what we're able to do is to really identify the salient themes in this data set. And actually, on the next slide, we have this spelled out, this process here. If we go to that, and I think there's a little delay if everyone's seeing the slide. I think you can see the slide, right? And you see here, this is where we go in and code the data in step 2. That we use AI-powered text analytics. And you see the radar graph here on this slide. You can see that now out of, in this case, we have 120 respondents surveyed. 45% of the respondents spoke of the theme dependability for Nike. Okay, so the one way you can read this is to say that, well, this is what's naturally occurring for Nike when they are asked an unprompted question. We just said, what is trust built upon, and we don't give any further guidance or any further indication what we're looking for. You see the image cloud here, and that's the image cloud related to all of these dimensions here: dependability, push forward, new ideas, comfort and safety, and goal driven. So that's the entire image cloud. And we're going to drill down in a bit. We're going to drill down into more details around what this means here. The size of the images here are related to the frequency by which they were selected. So obviously a larger image means more respondents selected that. I think that's a bit for the process now. Let's take a look at the next slide, because then we're going to look into these dimensions in more detail. I think what we hear from a lot of our clients is that when you do a more traditional quantitative study and you try to understand what a brand is and what it isn't, it's based on these long attributes of a long list of attributes, brand attributes, and the respondent indicates on a 5 or 7 point scale. Now, and when we do that kind of research, we use words that we think we know what they mean, but do we really know what they mean? What does dependability mean? I think you can make the case that what dependability means for Nike is something very different than what dependability means is for Bank of America, for example, as a brand, or any other brand for that matter. So we have to understand these constructs in the domain of the brand, and that's oftentimes when in the more traditional survey that is measured on a 5 or 7 point scale, we don't get that richness around what's behind them. So you see here in this study, the 5 salient themes. Dependability, well, in this case, we see from Nike perspective, the product is really one that is deemed as, that is it's material, quality material that is durable. They stand the test of time, so they're trusted to last. What we will see in a bit is that dependability, that is clearly a product feature, but it also has a very much emotional component to it. And I think one thing where we oftentimes see there's a bit of confusion between the functional and the emotional is that brands are both functional and emotional at the same time. It's not like we're just going to say brands are emotional. That emotion is built, the emotional connection that people have to brands, that is built on something. In this case for Nike, it's very much built on that dependability, and which is rooted in a product that is just superior in many ways, or at least perceived to be superior relative to competition. The other themes we have here, push forward, we just briefly look at these here. So the push forward theme, if you look at the Nike positioning about kind of achieve the competitiveness in every person, you can see how that comes out here in terms of propelling people forward, with a sense of that motivation and passion. That's what the brand is able them to achieve, that sense of performance. The other thing, next one here, is new ideas. That it's not just about boundaries of what's possible, but also in terms of being in tune with times. And I think, as you will see with Nike's latest endorsement in terms of the advertising, that's clearly taking a stand on social issues and social ideas that can be controversial. The next one is comfort and safety, that the brand actually provides a sense of feeling that there is trust to be protected and to offer kind of a physical protection, and that is also laddering up to an emotional connection of protection and feeling cared for. And the last one is goal-driven, and this is about, you know, accomplishing the feats that are not, you know, not just the biggest one, but also small ones, so large and small feats, and get that support for your life accomplishments. So, of course, now we're looking at one brand at a time, and you can imagine that if you were doing this for your brand, you can also do a second or a third brand and see how brands are different and activate different things. At a product level, you may be 99.9% the same as another brand, but you may have a very different profile in terms of how these dimensions here, how they are activated for your brand, and how you really need to understand what is most important from a more experiential and emotional and symbolic level for the consumer. If we go to the next slide, you'll see some more context around these dimensions. I referred to this before. You know, how do we know what dependability means, for example? One thing here, what is very powerful with this technique is that when we report out the data, you also get the visual representation of this. So it's not just words. It's true that in the text analytics space, we are analyzing just the text data, and so we're basically using the image as a way for people to verbalize their deeper thoughts and feelings about trust in this case. But then once we have analyzed the data and we know that, okay, here's a quote or a series of quotes that talk about dependability, we then bring back the images to illustrate that. Because the images are helpful also for us as a research audience to understand how is it that people visualize the brand or the context around it, in this case with trust. And you can see the notion of strength that comes out, and if you look at from more a semiotic perspective of the images here, in terms of the fight here between the two animals, or the sturdy wall, or the chain link here, is that there's really strength in something that can't break. And you can see that initially that, of course, is a very functional characteristic of the brand, but it also speaks to the kind of emotional strength that you can get from this brand by using the brand. We then move on, you see comfort and safety articulated in different ways. And this is what's fantastic with images, is that they are fluid in nature in terms of what they mean. So we, of course, know what the images in our database, what they typically are used, what they typically mean for people. But keep in mind that a single image always means multiple things. It's not just one thing. And people see different things in the same image for different questions. And this is just naturally a way for us as humans. We communicate visually, and that's a huge part of how we understand the world. We're not just communicating with words or written words, but visual communication is key for humans. And if you think about how advertising are using visuals to create the idea of the brand, you see that this link here, keeping a visual line of communication with consumers into research, is extremely powerful. Anyone who, you know, when you turn this research over to a creative agency, they basically eat it up because they get a link to the visual representation of how people think about the brand, that it's not just reduced to a bar chart or a simple number. Lastly, here you see the new ideas here, how that's reflected, and that's more about these social dimensions that are coming out, that Nike is taking a stand. And you know, I think Nike made up their minds around what kind of side of history they wanted to be on. And they basically thought about, well, where's the future for the brand, and made a calculation that millennials are going to be far more in favor of supporting Colin Kaepernick. And so doing so was actually has so far, I think what we can see is that it has paid off for them. We saw a few negative responses to it in this data set here, but all data that is out there suggests that Nike probably made the right calculation in terms of taking a stand on a major issue like that. So that kind of leads us to the next slide, just with some key takeaways here. When we look at the relationship that people have with Nike, to understand that the relationship that people have with brands is deeply personal. There's something that resonates with a person and how you articulate that relationship, and trust is very much part of how people use this brand in their and forms the basis for the relationship. You can see that trust originates from different sources. There are different dimensions to it, but at the root of it, if I can use this metaphor here, because it's basically a tree with major roots, is the notion of the durability of the product. And that's interesting because you can argue that most successful products that are really, or brands that are great over time, they have some level of superiority at the product level. It may not be, some can say that's completely just perceived, but that's, whether it's a perceived quality or a real quality, it doesn't matter. As long as people believe that these are really good quality products, Nike has then built a very powerful way of connecting that to an emotional story for the brand in terms of how it can be trusted for people to achieve their life goals of accomplishments and other, now even so from an identity perspective of for example, supporting Colin Kaepernick is a way to take a stand on something that means something way more beyond just the functionality of the product itself. And so this notion of dependability is something we believe can really be leveraged by Nike for product development, looking at innovation in terms of what kind of products can they deliver and how they can support future marketing campaigns. So that leaves us, that's a little case study here. We'd be happy we can talk about hours for Nike, but I think let's just move on to just take a quick look at how Meta for Insight works on the fuel cycle exchange. If we get that slide, which is coming up next. And so on the fuel cycle exchange, this is available for all of those who use this directly, the fuel cycle exchange. You basically link a visual exercise into your survey, and you can use that question. It's an open-ended question, and that's the beauty of this technique, is that it allows you to do what you typically do in qualitative data collection that requires more of a face-to-face interview. This is entirely self-administered here. And you ask that open-ended question with a visual technique. The data comes in and is analyzed with AI-powered text analytics. And then on the far right-hand side here, you see the dashboard from Visualytics. That's basically visual analytics that gives you a quantitative breakdown of the salient themes, the image clouds, and links to the verbatim that have been entered. There's also an option here, instead of typing text, the respondent can also record a self-recorded video. That's through the Vox PopMe integration, which is also on the Fuel Cycle Exchange. So you can combine both video and text here in your output. So it's a very versatile way of doing this. The next slide we're looking at is just like the different kinds of applications, what you can do. So thinking of the Meta for Insight exercise is an open-ended question. You can ask them in relation to a specific topic, like trust, for example, in the case of a brand. If you want to understand just the brand in general, you may not priming the respondent with trust, but just try to understand more with a projective question about what the brand is about and from more a consumer identity perspective. Then, the application, so it's a broad range of applications where you can use this questioning. It replaces, long batteries of 5-point Likert scale items with a much more open-ended question that allows the respondent to really bring to your attention what's important in their lives. So think of it this way: rather than bombarding the consumer or the respondent with 50 or 100 of a long list of attributes, ask them instead what's important to them and let them express. So it's kind of turning data collection a bit upside down here. Yes, it's qualitative to begin with, but it's quantifiable with the text analytics. So you get both the numbers and the rich context of the text data as well as the image data. So it kind of brings the best of both worlds together here across a number of different domains here, as you see, from ad testing to package testing, segmentation, and customer satisfaction, customer experience. So I think with that, I think we're basically ready for questions. What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, this is awesome stuff. It's one of my favorite things to hear, like especially when you think about something I learned from you maybe a year ago or so was like Likert scales developed in 1932. It's more for researchers than for respondents to share what they think, and so kind of flipping the model around and taking more organic input from respondents, I think is hugely valuable. So we have a few questions coming in now. So maybe we can start with the easiest one. which is how long does it take to receive results, kind of compared to let's say compared to a typical traditional study?
Yeah, that's a great question. So think of this as that you do a meta for insight exercise in the context of a normal survey. So this is one, so you don't have to just do a visual exercise. You can also combine this with other more traditional questions. Like there's nothing wrong with Likert scale questions. We just have to rely a little bit less on them. So if you want to combine a few Likert scale questions and a meta for insight exercise, you could do all of that in an online survey. So there's no, it's just as fast as any online survey that you would do. As soon as the results are in from a respondent, it's immediately available to view. So you don't have to wait. The dashboard actually gives you access to data in a real-time basis as soon as it's in.
Yeah, good stuff. Another question here from somebody who wishes to remain anonymous. Does the timing it takes for a respondent to select a visual and image matter? Meaning, is there a point where a response crosses over from subconscious, emotional to conscious, or rational? Perhaps like the speed of and kind of valence in general?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So the exercise, the way we built it, it doesn't measure the time it takes for the respondent to select an image. That's a slightly different technique to actually, and oftentimes also used more in a forced choice exercise where you have alternative images and you see the speed by which one is selected. This technique here, what we are using, is a way to basically allow people to use their visual communication skills and take it to a system one perspective by allowing them to think about the question that we're asking them through visuals. And that's important because when we are immediately asking people to let's say we ask the question, say, like, what does trust mean for you when it comes to Nike? If you don't do that through the visual, you immediately force it to a language level in terms of you have to put words onto it. Versus when we ask the respondent to select an image, we are bypassing language, oral and written language, and allow people to use visuals to express that. And that's what takes it to a system one perspective, because when the respondent is browsing images, the system one, the automatic brain, is non-consciously processing all those images. We are, of course, aware of what we see, but the amount of information that is there is beyond what we can process in a kind of cognitive, conscious way. And that's where the system one is helping us to do that. And then the system one directs us to select an image eventually, so that it gets to a conscious response. And then, of course, the verbalizing of it, that's where it takes it to a conscious level. So we kind of mixing the two levels here. We go from where system one plays a role in selecting the image to then a conscious response where the text data comes into play. But what's key here is that you're getting responses that people otherwise wouldn't have been able to give you had they just been asked an open-ended question without the visual stimuli.
Yeah, great stuff. And from Carrie, does the person select one picture or multiple pictures from each question?
Yeah, so typically the standard protocol is you select one image and then you do the write-up exercise. There is nothing that prevents you from going back and asking to select a second image. So that's also entirely possible to do. Keep in mind that it takes about 3 to 4 minutes for a respondent to complete the process of going through the image selection, writing and typing up the response. That's on average. Some people do it faster. If they do it on video, they can be a little bit faster. But then on the other hand, they may speak for a little longer if they do a Vox Populi video. So that might, even though you get more data, but it may take about the same time. So from a timing perspective, that's one thing to keep in mind if you do more than one image. But that's certainly a possibility to do 2 images. Yeah,
gotcha. And then from Ingrid, can you embed Metaphor Insight into other survey platforms like Qualtrics, or should we say SAP? Maybe Survey Gizmo, Survey Monkey, what does that look like?
Absolutely. So typically the way we do those is just with a redirect. So you start, so let's say the respondent starts on the Qualtrics platform, you redirect then onto Meta for Insight and complete the visual exercise, and then you can go back again. So the respondent ID gets captured to our platform and then sent back again. You can also pass URL variables if you have things that you want to serve up a particular brand for a particular respondent. So you can do link those. And so it's typically done with just a redirect. the respondent interface is very, it's neutral. So yes, it's going to look different from Qualtrics, yes, but it's not like it's night and day. So it's a very seamless process to do those redirects.
Gotcha. And then from Bruce, did Nike do this research before the Kaepernick commercial?
If they did, we don't know if they did, but we're going to have a conversation with them, so we'll find out.
Bruce, are you from Nike? That's what we want to know. And then I think the last question I have here, so if anybody wants to get any last minute questions here, oh, well, we got a couple more coming in. Whew, let me, Bruce is not from Nike. Thanks, Bruce. So somebody writes in and said, I'm interested in applying this methodology to an upcoming project, but I'm worried that it'll take some convincing to get stakeholder sign off. We're in the CPG space. Do you have a 1 or 2 sentence pitch that I could share with them why visual exercises are a valuable tool for us?
Yeah. So, I think this goes to the heart of innovation, right? It's like we all get excited when we see innovative ideas, and then, you go back to the realities of everyday life and internal stakeholders who just want the same old stuff again, and not any different. I think the pitch here is to say this is a very low risk thing to do, because it's not like you have to give up a whole lot of other things. Yes, in the context of, if you think about it, you're going to do an online survey and you say that we're going to have a 10-minute or 15-minute survey, you say, well, we allocate a bit of time for this, but we're going to have some of the more traditional measurements as well. And once people see this, they're going to say, well, like, wow, this is fantastic. I understand this in so much better ways, and it really complements that other cognitive data that I have. So it's more kind of a win-win rather than thinking that you're giving up a lot of things. Usually people throw too much stuff into a quantitative survey anyway, so there's usually room to say what is the least important we can peel away, and then add a visual exercise to add so much more richness to the study. So that's usually the approach we take, and that goes a long way. So what's interesting is that we actually work with a fair amount of companies that are in that more kind of from a very traditional space, and working quite conservative organizations, where we still found a lot of success with this, because at the end of it, it's still quantified. And when people understand that, yes, the visuals are just a way to get to people to articulate something that can be quantified, those kind of, the fears of this is kind of, it's overcome, and people see the benefits of it.
Yeah, so more complement than substitute, at least right away, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Zoe has a great question, and this is a great question because we just did a project on this together between Fuel Cycle and Protobrand. Zoe asked, how might a company strategize research utilizing this tool in the process of a rebrand to help the company design in a direction that most resonates with consumers?
Yeah, so is this in the context of like evaluating new creative, like a new logo, for example, or is it, because that's one thing you can use it for. Like if you're looking to rebrand and there's a new visual identity, understanding how a new identity will work relative to the existing one. And that's where you can test this in a very compelling way to see what is the natural discourse that's coming out, like what does this mean, and typically we do that with projective identity questions, like thinking about who is the person that is using the brand or is an avid supporter of the brand, or something along those lines, because you can see that design is very much a reflection, it is a reflection of the brand, but by extension also a reflection of the consumer and their match of the identity with the brand. And so testing new directions for the brand in this way, and do that, we recommend always testing this monadically so that each respondent will see just one particular design. And then you can compare on some key metrics, both match felicitation and other more cognitive measurements in terms of the effect of that design on key measurements and how the different designs perform to find the optimal, the perfect option for the rebrand.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I mentioned, we just did that for a client together. So I think it's a great use case and very useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is the last question. Again, last time I said last question, we got like 5 more questions. So maybe we'll. But Mary asked, what is the difference in response rate between these types of questions and kind of the quicker, easier, Likert scale type questions? And Mary offers up a prediction. She says, my guess is the quality of the responses outweighs the decrease in response numbers. So essentially, it's a difference in cooperation rate between like a Likert scale question and then the visual metaphor, like elicitation.
Right. So what you see when you run a study with meta felicitation is that if you run that, if you sample with a regular sample company, you'll see that you might see a slightly higher drop rate. That some people, when they get to meta felicitation, they just decide that no, the survey is not for me. And so you gotta have to, and then some people may go in there and try to enter like gibberish, which we have. Which we prevent. People can't enter gibberish because they will be told this is not a valid answer. They can't paste text and things like that. So they may decide to drop. My point here is that if people are not motivated to do that as part of the survey experience, what makes you believe that is a good respondent to answer Likert scale questions? How do you think they read your Likert scale questions? Do you think that they actually read them at all? I would highly question that. And yes, you can build in traps for straight liners and speeders, but you don't really know if they're smart enough to just vary their behavior, because if they are panelists that are regularly participating, they learn the kind of behavior they need to do to get through the survey, and those are the ones we actually don't want. So we actually have a very good quality control here in terms of what passes as good data, and I think that's an important part that in a more conventional survey is harder to prevent frauders from making it through.
Yeah, totally. I would have mentioned that myself. Is that good data quality controls here are pretty robust. Okay, so we actually have one more question. Backing in with Bruce, who's not from Nike. Can you test your brand and competitors in the same session? Like does the same respondent do 2, 3, or 4 brands? So maybe just a follow on to that one, Anders. So we talked about doing testing monadically, so you can essentially have people test 2 or 3 different brands. But what about doing like sequential monadic or comparisons to competitors?
Yes, you certainly can do that, and use, like, let's say you put multiple brands. So in this particular study here, we had Nike, we had just had one brand, and you could have added a second brand in and then rotated the order for respondents. There's a bit of effect doing that, and of course, most importantly, what it does is that it adds survey time. I'm a big believer in making surveys shorter and sweeter for people because we see better data. And so if sample is not an issue in terms of that if incidence is healthy and you're not looking for a needle in a haystack, I'd rather do more sample than trying to do a lot with each respondent. That's just in terms of data quality. We know now that more than half of respondents typically take a survey on a mobile, which means that they may not be at home, they might be out and about. And so making that survey experience as short and engaging as possible, that's why I kind of favor the monadic design, but it's certainly possible, and it's up to you to whoever, when you design the survey, it's like how much content you want to put in front of the respondent. Yeah,
absolutely. Great stuff. I think we got through all the questions. And if we don't stop now, we'll end up with a lot more, but which wouldn't be a problem. But if you do think of a question while you're falling asleep tonight and you're trying to remember all the things you learned about metaphor elicitation, mine and Anders' email addresses are there on the screen for you to reach out to. We will follow up with a recording of this presentation. And like we said, feel free to share with your friends, families, and loved ones. It's a great Thanksgiving feast fodder to talk about metaphor elicitation. So thanks for joining today.